On February 4th, 1983, Karen Carpenter collapsed at her parents' home in Downey, California, and one of the softest, most familiar voices in popular music was suddenly gone. She was only 32. That fact alone still feels impossible, because Karen Carpenter never sounded like someone who belonged to tragedy. She sounded like comfort. She sounded like rainy afternoons, quiet heartbreak, and the kind of sadness that could sit beside you without ever becoming cruel. That is what made the shock of her death so different from the fall of an ordinary star. The world was not losing only a singer. It was losing a voice that had already woven itself into private memory, into bedrooms, radios, car rides, family living rooms, and the quiet corners of people's lives. By the time the truth became clear, the ending felt even more devastating. Karen Carpenter died of heart failure caused by anorexia nervosa, and her death forced the public to confront a kind of suffering many people still barely understood. She had not died in a crash, a public scandal, or a dramatic overdose that tabloids could reduce to spectacle. She died from a war with her own body, a war that had been happening in plain sight while millions of people kept hearing only the beauty in her voice. That is the wound at the center of her story. A woman whose singing felt calm, warm, and emotionally safe had been disappearing inside herself for years. And when she finally fell, the world realized too late that the gentleness it loved in her voice had never meant she was protected from pain. What made Karen Carpenter's death so haunting was the contradiction between what people heard and what she was living through. On the surface, the Carpenters seemed to represent almost the opposite of danger. Their music was polished, clean, melodic, and emotionally precise. Karen's contralto voice was rich and intimate, and it made even loneliness sound graceful. That image became so powerful that the public often forgot there was a person underneath it. But there was. And by the mid-1970s, that person was already in trouble. Time reports that after being called chubby as a teenager, Karen began dieting, and what at first looked like ordinary weight loss slowly turned into something far more destructive. She dropped from around 145 pounds to a dangerously low weight, while friends, family, fans, and even the press often failed to understand what they were really seeing. That misunderstanding is crucial to the story. Karen Carpenter did not collapse in total secrecy. She collapsed while people watched, worried, commented, praised, criticized, and still did not truly know how to save her. And all the while, the success around her kept growing. Time notes that the Carpenters sold about 80 million records and won 3 Grammy Awards, which only deepens the sadness of what happened next. The more beloved Karen became, the more impossible it seemed that she could be breaking so badly behind the image. That is why this hook has to begin with death. Because once you know how her life ends, every note she sang starts to sound different. The softness becomes fragile. The beauty becomes ominous. The calm becomes almost unbearable. Karen Carpenter spent years making pain sound beautiful enough to live with. But in the end, the pain she was carrying inside her own body would not let her live at all. That is where this story begins. Not with the first song, not with the first album, but with the terrible realization that one of the gentlest voices in music died from a suffering the world was still learning how to name. Long before the world heard that unmistakable voice, Karen Carpenter was a teenager in Downey, California, still much more in love with rhythm than with the idea of being a star. Her family had moved from Connecticut to Southern California in 1963, and the shift mattered because it placed both Karen and her older brother Richard closer to the world that would eventually absorb them. At Downey High School, Karen joined the school band and first found the instrument that made sense to her before anything else did: the drums. The official Carpenters site notes that in Downey, Karen fell for the drums, while biographical accounts of her early life describe how intensely she threw herself into learning the instrument once she began. She was not dreaming of becoming a fragile pop icon then. She was a young musician obsessed with timing, motion, and control. A girl who practiced hard enough to make drumming feel like the first language her body truly understood. That matters because it changes the emotional shape of her origin. Karen Carpenter did not rise first as a singer standing delicately at the microphone. She began as a teenage drummer, driven, serious, and musically hungry, still far from the image that would later define her in the public imagination. Even the fact that she entered high school a year younger than many of her classmates adds something quietly revealing. Karen was always slightly out of step with the age and role the world expected her to fit. Before the records, before the polished melancholy, before the weight of being heard by millions, she was just a gifted young girl discovering that music could give her identity before fame ever did. That early identity deepened when she and Richard began playing together more seriously. By her mid-teens, Karen had joined the Richard Carpenter Trio on drums, and the structure of her future was slowly beginning to form. Research summaries of her life note that she was about 15 when she entered the trio, and by the late 1960s, the siblings had already passed through several musical configurations before becoming the duo the world would know as the Carpenters. What makes this period so important is that Karen was still not being shaped primarily as a vocalist in her own mind. She was the drummer first, the one anchoring the rhythm, the one building the frame around the sound. The official Carpenters biography also points to those years in Downey as the time when Richard found Karen's voice, which makes this phase feel almost like the slow discovery of a secret hidden in plain sight. She had the gift already, but the world had not yet decided what to call it. Nightclub jazz sets, local performances, demo recordings, and the long, uncertain apprenticeship of young musicians all mattered here because they gave Karen something more human than destiny. They gave her practice. They gave her failure, repetition, discipline, and the first real glimpses of what life in music might cost. Before A&M signed the Carpenters in 1969, before the hits, before the soft perfection of the public image, there was a young woman behind a drum kit learning that the future might demand more from her than she ever intended to offer. And that is what gives Part 2 its melancholy. Karen Carpenter did not walk toward fame as the person the world eventually loved. She walked toward it as a musician still becoming herself, unaware that the gentleness people would one day worship in her voice would also become part of the burden she was never fully allowed to put down. When the Carpenters finally broke through at the start of the 1970s, Karen Carpenter did not rise the way many pop stars do. She did not arrive like a force of disruption, a spectacle of rebellion, or a personality too loud to ignore. She rose through the opposite kind of power. Her voice was warm, low, intimate, and emotionally exact, the kind of voice that made sorrow sound gentle instead of dramatic. The official Carpenters site describes that trademark sound as Richard's layered production surrounding Karen's timeless voice, and says the public responded immediately, turning the duo into the top-selling American artists of the 1970s. Their success was not a niche success or a brief chart moment. It became huge, sustained, and culturally defining. By the time songs like They Long to Be Close to You, We've Only Just Begun, and Rainy Days and Mondays had settled into radios and living rooms, Karen was no longer simply a musician inside a sibling act. She had become one of the most recognizable voices in the world. Time later noted that the Carpenters sold around 80 million records and won 3 Grammy Awards, which helps explain why this part of her story has to feel so bright. What people loved about Karen was not only technical beauty, it was emotional safety. She could sing heartbreak without sounding theatrical, loneliness without sounding self-pitying, and desire without sounding desperate. That made her unusually powerful. In a decade full of excess, Karen Carpenter sounded clean without sounding empty, tender without sounding weak, and sad without ever losing control. The more famous she became, the more her voice seemed to belong to private life itself. People did not simply admire her. They leaned on her. They used her songs to survive their own disappointments, marriages, mournings, quiet breakdowns, and long drives home. That is what made her stardom different. It did not feel external. It felt personal. And once a singer reaches that level of intimacy with millions of strangers, the public begins to confuse the gift with the person. It starts to assume that the woman who sounds calm must somehow be calm, that the woman who makes pain sound beautiful must know how to endure pain herself. That illusion would become one of the cruelest parts of Karen Carpenter's life. Because while the world was falling in love with the softness of her voice, Karen herself was becoming increasingly trapped inside a body and image the public also felt entitled to judge. She always thought of herself first as a drummer, a point reflected in biographical summaries that describe her as a musician who began in rhythm and only gradually became recognized as the central voice of the Carpenters. Yet fame kept pulling her away from that original identity and narrowing her into something more fragile, more visually managed, and more exposed. Time reports that after being called chubby as a teenager, Karen began dieting, and what looked at first like a normal transformation slowly became dangerous as her weight dropped more and more. That detail matters because it places the first real darkness directly inside the brightest years of success. The public was hearing perfection, but Karen was already learning to distrust her own body. The more beloved she became, the more pressure there was to remain small, polished, gentle, and camera-ready. At the same time, her brother Richard was also under enormous strain, and the machinery around the duo kept moving. Records, touring, television appearances, expectations, endless demand. From the outside, it looked like stability. From the inside, it was becoming something much harder to survive. This is why part 3 cannot be told as a simple rise. It has to be told as a rise with a fracture hidden inside it. Karen Carpenter became a global star not because she forced attention, but because she made pain feel bearable. And the terrible irony is that while she was helping millions of people live with their sadness, she was beginning to disappear under pressures that neither fame nor love could stop. That is the real shadow beneath the golden years. Karen was being adored on a scale most artists only dream of, but she was also being slowly pushed toward a version of herself that the world found easier to celebrate than the real woman behind the voice. By the late 1970s, the brightness around Karen Carpenter had started to turn cruel. The records were still loved, the voice was still unmistakable, and to the public she still seemed to represent a kind of calm that other stars could never fake. But behind that image, her body was already becoming the battlefield of a private war that almost nobody around her fully understood in time. What had begun years earlier as dieting after being called chubby had turned into anorexia nervosa, and by the early 1980s the damage was no longer abstract. It was physical, escalating, and deadly. Karen kept trying to work, trying to recover, trying to return to some version of control, but the illness had already moved past the point where appearance alone could explain what was happening. The real horror of her story is that she did not collapse in hidden obscurity. She collapsed while the world still loved her voice, while people still played her songs at weddings, on radios, in cars, and in the background of ordinary life. The contrast is devastating. A woman who sounded so emotionally steady was living inside a body that was failing her more each month. On February 4, 1983, after waking at her parents' home in Downey, Karen collapsed and went into cardiac arrest. She was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead at 9:51 that morning, still only 32 years old. Later reporting tied her death to anorexia nervosa, and Time notes that the public shock around her death helped force a far wider conversation about eating disorders, because so many people had never truly understood that an illness like this could kill. That is what makes Karen Carpenter's ending feel different from ordinary celebrity tragedy. She did not die in scandal, violence, or chaos. She died from a disease that had been hiding in plain sight, while millions continued to hear only beauty. And because her voice had always sounded so warm, so elegant, so safe, the truth of what was happening to her body felt almost impossible for the public to absorb. In many ways, the Karen Carpenter story is one of the cruelest contradictions in American pop culture. The gentlest voice of her generation was being hollowed out by one of the harshest illnesses imaginable, and the world did not know how to hear the danger until the silence arrived. The funeral only made that contradiction more painful. On February 8, 1983, Karen Carpenter's funeral was held at Downey United Methodist Church, and the service drew a crowd large enough to make clear just how deeply she had entered public feeling. UPI reported that about 700 people packed the church, while additional mourners and fans gathered outside to say goodbye. The names present said one thing. The atmosphere said something even heavier. This was not simply the farewell to a successful singer. It was the farewell to a voice people had built into the emotional fabric of their lives. Getty's editorial archive shows the visual power of that day clearly. Karen's casket being placed into an ambulance, her parents leaving the church, the controlled grief of a public goodbye that felt too large for the modesty of her image. Afterward, she was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Cypress, California, later reinterred with her parents at Pierce Brothers Valley Oaks Memorial Park. But the grave was never really the end of Karen Carpenter's story, because her death kept echoing long after the funeral flowers were gone. Time argues that Karen's death changed the way many people talked about anorexia, and that is part of why her legacy remains so unusual. She left behind hit records, yes. She left behind one of the most recognizable voices in modern music, yes. But she also left behind a warning. Not the loud kind, not the moralizing kind, but a warning made unbearable precisely because it came from someone so associated with softness. Karen Carpenter did not look like the face of danger. She looked like reassurance. She did not sound like collapse. She sounded like grace. And maybe that is why her story continues to hurt on a deeper level than ordinary nostalgia. The songs are still beautiful, still intimate, still capable of making a room feel quieter and more honest. But once you know how the story ends, the beauty changes. It becomes heavier. Every note seems to carry the shadow of the body that could not keep carrying the voice. That is the final truth Karen Carpenter leaves behind. Some stars are remembered because they burned loudly. Karen is remembered because she faded in a way the world did not know how to stop, and because even after death, her voice kept doing what it had always done, entering people's lives gently and staying there.